The rain had been falling for 3 days without pause, soaking the world in a relentless gray misery. The trenches had become rivers of mud, swallowing boots and pooling around the ankles of exhausted soldiers. What once were walls of sandbags and timber now sagged under the weight of the storm, leaking steadily, as if even they were weary of the fight. The smell was a mixture of wet earth, sweat, and the faint metallic sting of rusting weapons. Private Thomas Whitaker sat with his back pressed firmly against the cold, damp sandbags, the chills seeping through his uniform and into his bones. His greatcoat, once a proud mark of military service, was nothing more than a sodden rag that clung to his skin, heavy with water. Droplets rolled steadily from the brim of his helmet, striking the ground with a rhythm that matched the steady pounding in his head. He no longer bothered to brush them away. After 3 days of rain, the wet had become part of him, as natural as breathing. Above the trenches, the sky was a sheet of shifting black clouds. Every now and then, a jagged streak of lightning tore it open, followed quickly by the guttural roar of thunder. But the thunder was not alone. It mixed with another sound, the deep, stomach-churning rumble of distant artillery. To Thomas, it sounded like a pair of angry gods locked in endless combat, their fury raining down on the earth and everyone unfortunate enough to be caught in between. He closed his eyes, hoping to escape it for just a moment. But peace never came. Even with his lids shut, the battlefield invaded his mind. Each time the horizon flared with fire, it painted the backs of his eyelids with flashes of red and orange. The explosions became like grotesque fireworks, reminders that war offered no darkness, no safe silence, only a ceaseless rhythm of noise and light. It was the 3rd year of the war. Once, Thomas had kept track of time carefully, marking off days on a tattered pocket calendar, measuring the distance between now and home. At first, he had believed that each passing day brought him closer to the end. But as the months turned to years, as promises of victory came and went, the calendar lost its meaning. The little squares of numbers became meaningless scratches, reminders only of how long the nightmare had lasted. Now, time itself felt broken. There were no weeks, no months, no years in the trenches, only the cycle of waiting, fighting, surviving, and waiting again. The soldiers measured their lives not by calendars, but by dawns and dusks, by how many times they woke to the sound of shells and how many times they survived until nightfall. For Thomas, life had been stripped down to its barest core. There were no dreams of glory left, no thoughts of medals or parades. What mattered was survival, one more dawn, one more breath, one more heartbeat. And in the silence between barrages, as the rain continued to fall, he wondered how many more heartbeats his body still had to give. Thomas Whitaker had never dreamed of becoming a soldier. The idea of carrying a rifle, of marching into battlefields soaked with blood, had never entered his mind during the quiet years of his youth. His world had once been confined to the chalkboards and benches of a modest schoolhouse in Sussex, where he worked as a teacher of history. There, his days were filled with lessons about kings and empires, maps pinned to the wall, and children who groaned about homework or whispered jokes when they thought his back was turned. He had been proud of that life. It was steady, meaningful, and innocent in its own way. But when the call came, when Parliament declared that every able-bodied man was needed to fight, his life was overturned. Suddenly, the abstract words he had once taught in the classroom, duty, honor, sacrifice, were no longer just ideas from dusty textbooks. They became demands, heavy and unavoidable, pressed into the lives of men like him. In speeches and newspapers, they sounded noble, glowing with patriotic fire. But even as Thomas signed his name on the enlistment papers, part of him wondered if those words would feel so noble when written in blood on a battlefield. He did not enlist for his own glory. His thoughts were of home, of his family, and most of all, of his younger brother William. William was only 17, bright and eager, but too young to be drafted by law. Thomas had promised his mother that William would be kept safe, that he, the elder brother, would shoulder the duty so the younger could remain in Sussex, free to finish his studies and inherit a life unbroken by war. When Thomas boarded the train to the training camp, his mother wept silently, clutching William's hand. Thomas had smiled, forcing courage into his voice. "I'll be fine. It will be over before long." He had wanted to believe that himself. The weeks of training were exhausting, yet the men endured with a strange sort of excitement. They were, after all, on the threshold of something that felt grand and historic. Young men from farms, villages, and towns stood shoulder to shoulder, laughing, boasting, singing as they learned to march, to drill, to polish their boots until they gleamed. To many, the uniform itself was enough to fill them with pride. They carried their rifles as though they were not weapons but badges of honor, symbols that they were part of something larger than themselves. When the first march to the front began, it carried the same energy. Columns of men moved through muddy roads, singing songs to drown out the gnawing fear in their stomachs. Some joked about how quickly the war would be won. "Home by Christmas," they said, with grins that were half bravado, half hope. The villages they passed cheered them on, women waving handkerchiefs, children clapping and calling them heroes. For a while, Thomas almost believed it. Almost. But the front had no patience for illusions. The moment they reached the trenches, the air changed. The songs, once so loud, faltered into silence. The first night brought the smell, an unforgettable mixture of smoke, rot, and human despair. The second night brought the sound, the endless thunder of artillery, so loud it shook the earth. And soon enough, the days brought death. The rifles that had once been carried so proudly grew heavy in their hands. The cheerful laughter of the march turned into quiet mutters, then to silence. The bravado drained from the faces of boys who suddenly seemed far younger than they had on the road. Thomas survived his first battles, though he never knew exactly how. He remembered charging forward when the whistle blew, stumbling across fields torn apart by shells. He remembered mud clinging to his boots like chains, bullets hissing past his ears, men falling beside him with cries that tore through the smoke. Somehow, through blind chance or fate, he always came out breathing. But survival came at a cost. Every time he lifted his head after a battle, he saw faces that would never look back again. Friends he had shared bread with hours earlier now lay broken and still in the mud. The screams of the dying clung to his ears, replaying in the moments between shellfire, haunting the few hours of restless sleep he managed to snatch. In those early weeks, Thomas realized that innocence had no place in war. Whatever remained of it was buried quickly, alongside the bodies hastily covered with mud. The boyish dreams of honor and heroism that had carried men into the trenches evaporated like mist under gunfire. What remained was something colder, harder. The will to endure, to breathe through another day, to survive. For Thomas, every dawn became both a curse and a gift. A curse because it meant another day of war, another day of mud, fear, and death. But a gift, too, because it meant his heart still beat, his promise to his mother and William still held, and his duty, though heavy, was still being fulfilled. He no longer thought of medals or victory speeches. His purpose had been reduced to the simplest, rawest of goals: to survive long enough to see the end, and to keep the darkness of war from swallowing what was left of his family. Among the soldiers, Thomas found companionship in Corporal Edward Ned Harrington, a tall man with sharp eyes and a quiet strength. Ned rarely spoke of home, but when he did, it was of wide fields in Kent and a little daughter who waited for him. He carried her picture in his breast pocket, pulling it out when the nights grew too long. "You'll meet her someday, Whitaker," Ned said one evening, as the sound of gunfire echoed in the distance. "When this madness ends, I'll invite you to my farm. You can teach her how to read properly. She's only 5, but already curious about everything." Thomas smiled. "I'd like that." That promise became Thomas's lifeline. He held on to it when the bullets screamed above his head, when the ground shook, when the fear threatened to break him. The thought of surviving not just for himself, but to meet Ned's daughter became a quiet prayer. The order came suddenly. They were to storm Grey Hill, a fortified ridge that had swallowed 3 battalions already. The officers said it was critical for the war effort. The men said it was suicide. The morning of the attack was eerily quiet. Mist rolled over the land, shrouding everything in ghostly white. Thomas adjusted his helmet, his hands trembling. Ned patted his shoulder. "Stay close. We'll make it." When the whistle blew, the soldiers surged out of the trenches. The world erupted. Machine guns spat fire, shells exploded, and men fell like wheat before a scythe. Thomas ran, mud splashing beneath his boots, heart hammering louder than the explosions. He fired blindly, ducked, stumbled, rose again. Halfway up the hill, a shell landed nearby, hurling him into the dirt. His ears rang, vision blurred. He crawled forward, dragging his rifle. Around him, men screamed and bled. Through the smoke, he saw Ned, standing tall, firing until his rifle clicked empty. Then he reached for his pistol, covering his men as they advanced. For a moment, he seemed invincible. But fate was merciless. A bullet struck him in the chest. He staggered, eyes wide, before collapsing. Thomas screamed, rushing to his side. "Ned, stay with me." Blood stained Ned's uniform, spreading like a dark flower. His lips trembled, whispering words Thomas barely heard. Tell her I kept my promise. Tell her Daddy fought brave." And then his eyes dimmed. Thomas froze, the world spinning around him. In that moment, he felt something break inside him. Rage and grief consumed him, drowning the fear. He rose, shouting, firing, pushing forward until his rifle was hot in his hands. He didn't care if he lived or died. He only cared that Ned's sacrifice meant something. By nightfall, Grey Hill was theirs. But victory felt hollow. The ground was covered in bodies, friends and foes alike. Among them lay Ned, his hand still clutching the picture of his daughter Emily. Back at the camp, Thomas sat alone, staring at a piece of paper. He tried to write a letter to Margaret Harrington, Ned's wife, to tell her about his bravery, about the way he smiled even in the darkest hours. But words failed him. How couldn't capture a man's soul? How could he tell a little girl that her father would never return? He folded the blank paper, slipping it into his pocket. He would carry Ned's story until he could deliver it in person. That became his mission, more than fighting, more than surviving. He would go home and look into Emily's eyes and tell her the truth. Months passed. Battles blurred together. The war dragged on, relentless. Thomas became harder, quieter, older in spirit though still young in years. His comrades called him the Silent One, because he rarely spoke except when necessary. But inside, he spoke endlessly, to Ned, to the ghosts of the fallen, to the memories of home. Each day was a battle not only against the enemy, but against despair. One winter night, as snow fell silently over the trenches, Thomas gazed at the sky. He wondered if Emily was looking at the same stars. He wondered if the children he once taught still remembered their teacher. He wondered if the world would ever know peace again. The guns eventually fell silent. The war ended not with cheers, but with exhaustion. Soldiers returned home carrying scars no one could see. When Thomas stepped off the train back into his hometown, the streets were lined with flags and cheers. But he felt like a stranger. The air smelled of bread and flowers, not smoke and blood. Children ran laughing through the streets, reminding him of faces he would never see again. He walked slowly to the address Ned had written in his notebook, a small farmhouse on the edge of town. His heart pounded as he approached the door. A little girl answered. She had Ned's sharp eyes. Behind her stood Margaret Harrington, her face pale but kind. Thomas removed his cap, bowing slightly. "I served with Edward. I was his friend." Margaret's eyes welled with tears. She invited him inside. For hours, Thomas told stories of Ned's courage, his laughter, the way he kept everyone going when hope seemed lost. He left out the horror, choosing instead to give them the Ned he knew, strong, brave, full of love for his family. When he finished, Emily climbed into his lap and whispered, "Thank you for bringing my daddy back to me." Thomas hugged her tightly, tears streaming down his face. In that moment, he realized he had finally kept his promise. Years later, Thomas returned to teaching. His students knew him as a quiet man with kind eyes, who sometimes stared out the window too long. He never glorified war in his lessons. Instead, he spoke of peace, of understanding, of the value of life. On his desk, framed carefully, was a picture of a soldier holding his daughter. Beneath it, a simple note. He kept his promise. The war had taken much, but it had also given him a duty to remember, to honor, to teach. And though the battlefield was silent now, its echoes lived on in the stories he told and in the lives of those who would never forget.